I am Dr. Marnie Jull. It's my fancy professor name. And I am an associate professor in the Conflict Analysis and Management program at Royal Roads University. And I'm also the program head of the Conflict Analysis and Management program. And with us today, because nothing happens without a team, you've already met Selena Kumar, who's the education advisor, and Alana, who is another education advisor who's smiling at us. And then behind the scenes is Karen Soquera, who looks very sporty in this picture and is also sporty in real life. And she is our marketing advisor. So the four of us are behind the scenes working to build our learning community that we're having now, which wouldn't be possible unless you showed up. So I wanted to really welcome you and invite you to turn on your mic for just a second and say, if you feel comfortable, just where you're coming in from, the name of the city, the place, whatever you'd like to, and then we're going to do a quick land acknowledgement as well. So if you feel comfortable, just remember to turn off your mics, but just say hello from Victoria, hello from Calgary, wherever you're coming from, and we get to kind of listen to the choir of voices saying hello. Everybody ready? Okay, 1, 2, 3, go.
Hello
from
Victoria.
Hello
from London, UK.
Hello from Kelowna.
Hello from Cumberland.
Ron Fisher.
Oh, that was great. That was wonderful. So nice to see so many people joining us. And so now I want to turn as well to acknowledging the land. And with Royal Roads, we are really committed to reconciliation as an organization and as a community. And so what that means for us is that we do our best to acknowledge the land in a meaningful way. With walking the talk, it means that we live our values and work with alignment and congruity and integrity, which then builds together energy and confidence and security in that connection with the land. So I'd like to take a minute too to kind of do this in a way that connects with the content that we're talking about. For those of you who may not know this wonderful woman, her name is Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a botanist, a scientist, and an Indigenous wisdom keeper, really. And she's pictured there in her amazing book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which I have by my bed, and it's really changed the way that I think of many things, including relationship to the land. And you can see her there with like her good friend, the tree. And so I'd like to invite you in just the next minute or so to start typing in the chat what you would like to acknowledge in the land. So sometimes we acknowledge, and very importantly, as I'm just about to do, is that the Indigenous peoples who came before us on the land that we are at. But for some people, they may not know who the Indigenous people were, or what the treaties may have been, and whether it's ceded or unceded. And so I also want to take the time for those who want to also connect with something of the land that's meaningful to you in this moment. So I have a tree right outside my window. And so in acknowledging that tree, there's a way in which I'm acknowledging my interdependency. And it also grounds me in my sense of place with a tree. And again, for those of you who may not feel comfortable doing that, you may want to just take a moment to acknowledge the fossil fuels that brought you in your car, which is also part of our living world that from millions of years ago. So whatever you feel comfortable with in acknowledging our interdependency with the land and the people that came before us. I'll give you now to just invite you to start putting that in the chat box. And I'll take this moment to acknowledge where Royal Roads is situated and where I am on the traditional territories of the Kosepsum and Lekwungen families, who have really stewarded that land and this place that I'm on for thousands of years. And Royal Roads itself is a gathering place for millennia, where people came to learn, share, be welcomed by the inhabitants, and exchange. So in that spirit, I'm also inviting us into this learning system that we're now in the sense of community. And so in that spirit as well, I'll just ask who you'd like to acknowledge, and that's already starting in the chat right now. But it's great to see people adding that in. one of the joys of being in an online environment is that we kind of all get to speak simultaneously, which you never really get to do. And so we can have lots of introductions. I'm also going to invite you to speak with each other on the chat. And so if something comes up that someone has identified, or a question that comes up, feel free to pop in another answer, or to engage with each other, so that we also build this community. Because frankly, we've all given an hour of our time for this event. And so how can we enrich each other and ourselves as much as possible? So I really do want to invite you to get engaged, because it makes us all richer and wiser for participating in such an important topic as conflict, creativity, and collaboration. So with today's webinar, the things that we're going to do, the journey that we're on together, is we'll talk about the sense of before and after the conflict, how conflict behavior can emerge and change, the difference between technique and method. We'll involve ourselves as part of a conflict system, and we'll consider possibilities of supporting authentic curiosity to self and other. So as I'm looking at the chat, I'm just feeling so delighted with all the ways that people acknowledge, from the Bright Mountain Ashberries to Treaty 7 and the traditional territories of the Stoney Nakoda, as well as people who are actually able to write in the Musqueam language. So way to go. It's just really lovely to see all the ways that people are acknowledging how we're interconnected and connected to the people who came before us and the generations that will come after us. So here we go. In the spirit of considering conflict, I'm going to turn the screen share over to Selena and ask her to get you involved in thinking about this important question of, when you think about a conflict that you've been in or know about, in one word, what has come up for you. And so you can go into that. I've just taken myself off share, and we're going to put that link into the chat box. So you can go to the chat now that you've all had practice chatting away. You follow that link, and in one word, you can identify what is the feeling or the thought that comes up for you as you think about a conflict that you've been involved in or that you know about. So we can start watching this grow. So we have regret, sad, frustration, and as you add words, the Menti magically adds this into our word cloud. So we can watch the numbers of responses also get. So we have confusion and hopeless. And I'm asking you to also connect with that felt sense, because something that we'll discuss as we go on is that conflict behavior is a result of what we think and what we feel. What we do is intimately connected to that. And now let's go to the next question, which is, when you think about a conflict and how it's been resolved for you. So it's something that has, I'm going to show you the question so you can, visual learners will love this. There we go. Think of a time when a conflict has been resolved or changed. What feelings or thoughts come up for you in that situation? So we're going back to Selena's screen, and I hope you guys are all impressed with our incredible technical wizardry that you see unfolding in front of your very eyes. And you can also be proud of your own technical wizardry that we're contributing to this word cloud that's coming up. And great to see it in the chat as well. So that sense of unbalanced or hopelessness and puzzlement. And here we have this word cloud coming up. Relief, the gigantic relief word. When you go from that sense of that kind of contracted, aversive feelings of conflict to the sense of peace, happy, thankful, a sense of growth. May this be a portal. Collaboration, you feel heard. There's a sense of release as well that can take place. Yeah, so there we go. There's lots of words that emerge from that. And those are more than words, those are our felt responses, which, as I say, we need in order to be able to use ourselves within our systems through which conflict transformation can take place. So back to me in the screen share. What is conflict? So if you've been anywhere near the conflict literature, and I've spent quite a bit of time, although I'm delighted to see Dr. Ron Fisher has joined us as well. And Ron has been instrumental in starting the conflict analysis and management program and is a longtime scholar of the conflict field. And so he'll likely be the first to tell you that conflict, the numbers of definitions for conflict is vast. So what is conflict? Is it incompatible goals, as Fisher and Urey might suggest, and they're getting to yes? Is it unmet needs that people like John Burton and Marshall Rosenberg have been famous for in their nonviolent communication? Is it something more like a struggle? Is it a difference of opinion? Are there competing interests, which is also a very typical definition of conflict? Conflict sometimes is associated with violence. So there's a number of different definitions of conflict. And what's important, and in this webinar that lasts only an hour, I'm not going to be able to go into an in-depth discussion of the different concepts and what that means, because frankly, we can take 2 years to talk about this. But what I will do is I'll lightly introduce you to the area of research that I'm involved in called the insight approach, where what we look at is both a cognitive and decision-making model to understand how we make decisions within complex systems. And so we're going to look at behavior first. So if we look at this behavior that this polar bear mother is doing, is she attacking or defending? She's looking like she's attacking in a very aggressive kind of way, and it's also clear that she's defending. And when we think more deeply about the necessary ingredients for conflict, so on the previous screen, there's incompatible goals and unmet needs and competing interests. And really, we have these all the time. There's incompatible goals, say between Selena and I, about whether we like the colors red or blue. And it's only when we have to decide what color we're going to paint that particular wall that we might end up having a conflict. And so the two elements, according to the insight approach, that are really necessary for conflict is both a decision to defend and a perception of threat. So without threat, there would be no need to defend. And we don't necessarily even need to defend against the perception of threat. We could respond to threat with a more collaborative approach. So in order to have a conflict, and more specifically, if we engage in conflict behavior, it comes from a decision to defend against the perception of threat. And it's really important to think about conflict not as something abstract or as out there, but conflict as behavior that people are enacting. And why is that important? Well, there's a number of different things that people do in their decisions to defend against a discernment of threat. And here's 4 kinds of responses that people as well as animals do. So you're probably quite familiar with them, the left hand of the polar bear, who's in a more attacking kind of way of defending. And then the typical rabbit response that some of us have is the effort to flee. There's 2 others. So you can see these over on the far right, the reptile insect, who looks very much like part of the tree, has frozen. And it's like, nothing to see here, folks, just keep moving on. And many of us do as well in that frozen stance in the response to threat. And there's also the fawning that someone will, this wolf is doing to the more alpha wolf in that very subservient way. And so if you think about human behavior, this is an example that I'll often use in a classroom. If this happened to be you walking towards your car and you see a bylaw officer about to give you a ticket, you may engage in one of these behaviors. You may freeze and just hope that nobody sees you until the officer goes away. You may run, go the other direction. You may engage in some kind of aggressive behavior about, like, do you have nothing better to do than ticket law-abiding citizens? Or you may engage in some kind of subservient behavior, going and thanking the police officer for looking after the city so well and hoping that that will reduce your effort, your fine. So all of those are conflict behaviors. And sometimes that can be enormously helpful in understanding conflict itself. One of the questions that we had before the webinar, because Selena and her team have done this very clever thing of asking if there's any questions that you might have before coming into the webinar. And I had a chance to review some of them. One of the questions was, how do you deal with someone who refuses to engage? And if we understand that refusal to engage itself is a form of conflict behavior, it can lead us to a line of questioning and a new way of engaging with that avoidant behavior. So we've talked about conflict behavior and as a decision to defend against the discernment of threat. Although we can understand that in this case of, say, myself and this police officer, what happens when we scale up and we start thinking about systems? So these two pictures are taken from recent protests in the Black Lives Matter movement. The one on the right is taken from Voice of America, as is the one on the left. And it can sometimes be difficult in thinking about systems when we look at the picture on the right, where there's this enormous crowds of people, to think about how conflict behavior is really decisions that people are making within their roles and their complex social contexts. And if we think about that, we have a way of understanding change and fostering creativity and collaboration in a way that I'll talk about in a moment. Because for every picture on the top where we have these crowds of people, we also have these people on the bottom. And you can see it very poignantly in this, where you have a white protester recording a Black police officer. So people are making decisions on an individual level in ways that are carried and shaped by their roles within these complex social contexts. What's remarkable as well is when we see how change happens through individual decision making. We see on the right the chief of police, Peter Pazen, who marched arm in arm in solidarity with the Black Lives protesters on the streets. And you also see groups of police officers taking a knee with other protesters in Atlanta. So how are these decisions different from these decisions? Once again, it's individuals within their roles. This kind of taking the knee was not possible even, like, let's say 6 months ago, that a year ago when the football player Kaepernick was taking a knee, and it was scandalous on his own. And now we have large groups of people doing this in relation to each other. So how then do we make these different decisions? Clearly, not one police officer is making this decision on his own or her own. It has come within their role, within the pattern of interaction, whereby they have decided through the orders of their superiors as well as a group to make that response to the protesters that they face. How do we make different decisions then? And so if we were in a classroom, I would show you one of the the model of the operations of consciousness that we use in the classroom that is drawn from the insight approach. But we have only an hour. And so the short answer is we make different decisions when we have different understanding, when we discern fresh significance, when our valuing is different, when we can identify new options, or we prioritize differently. And so there's no new information, let's say, about the Black Lives Matter, is that police officers were aware that Black citizens were disproportionately affected by violence. But the significance is now different. New options have become possible and new priorities have been enacted, so that you see groups of police officers who are now taking the knee in relation to protesters. So different decisions are made because they're responding to threat in a different way. In other words, we're making decisions because we're using our minds. And so when we're using our minds, we can either be in a very contracted response to threat, where our reptilian brain has activated and the options that we're facing are much more narrow. We become more incurious than curious. We can become much more rash than conscientious, and we can become much more hasty than critical. I'm also aware that there may be questions that are going on in the chat, and I'd like to invite you to if there are questions, to add comments, and I'm going to do more of a question storming at the end. And I'm also going to invite you to take a risk to ask a question or make a comment, even if it's not something that you normally do, because again, with that idea of that it enriches the community as a whole when you take that step forward. And I also ask if you're someone who's like always peppering the chat box, you know, to also hold back, to give space for other people. Because you too are using your minds. And in doing that, I'm actually asking you to make decisions in a particular way. So I'm giving you some of the valuing about let's get space for people. I'm also giving you some valuing around what can we do together to build our learning. And I'm asking you to consider some other options in how you're making a decision. So whether you're here in a webinar or you're in some kind of conflict, you're using your minds, and you can be using your mind with a more kind of contracted and rash way or in a more conscientious and expansive way. So what can often happen in the sort of short weekend courses or 1 hour webinar courses like this is that you can kind of get peppered with some techniques for conflict resolution. And probably most of us have heard something about active listening. This was just like when I did Google images, these are all the things that came up for me about active listening. And I picked out one. It's from the organization of the Center for Creative Leadership, which I really like as an organization. So I'm not knocking this at all, but I'm going to go through it and then show what some of the limits of techniques can be. So here we have an active listening model. Be attentive, you ask the open-ended questions, you ask your probing questions, you get your clarification, you paraphrase, then you're attuned to the feelings, you summarize, and you repeat. And it's not that linear, you could probably go back and forth. The problem with technique is that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, even active listening itself. So here you have a picture of sort of this dog that hasn't quite met the mark. Because one of the challenges of, say, asking open-ended questions over here is that the question, an open-ended question, as you probably know, is one to which the answer is not yes or no. A closed question, according to typical technique, is one that's only yes or no. So is it 3 o'clock today? Is either answered yes or no. What time it is one that could be answered in a number of ways. So an open-ended question in itself is not necessarily helpful, because what's the matter with you is just as open as what do you hope will be better. So the kinds of questions that we ask and the way our questions are targeted at people's own ways of knowing and valuing and deciding really matter. And we have to be quite aware of what it is that we're doing when we're asking those kinds of questions. They also, in the active listening model, is talking about be attuned and reflect feelings. Well, how do you reflect escalating emotions if someone keeps getting angrier? Sometimes that can be a challenge as people escalate and feel that they're not being heard, let's say, and their anger continues to escalate. So once again, if we had a few hours or a few years together, we could talk about how to deal with escalating emotions. And one of the things I can say right away is an unaddressed emotion will often escalate. It's when we acknowledge the emotion that people can begin to explain what is the significance behind the emotion, that we can then actually start having a conversation about what really is the significance of that emotion. Similarly, with the advice to paraphrase, over here in the bottom, is that what do you do when you paraphrase something like how do you handle a moralizing judgment when someone says you're a liar? So it's difficult to paraphrase that. Either I hear that you think that I'm lying, or so you think that I'm lying, or you think I'm a liar, will kind of invite a defensive response. Because I don't know about you, but I would get very defensive when those kinds of moralizing judgments come at me. And I found that it can be very helpful to have an ability to ask a curious question like, what is it that I've done that leads you to think that I'm a liar? And to be able to unpack that. So then when I did X, then you felt Y, and now I can have a deeper understanding. But it's super hard to be curious in those conditions of threat. We'll come back to that in a second. The point that I want to make here is that there's a difference between a technique and a method. So over here we have this active listening technique, which, as I said, I'm not knocking at all, and it's from a very credible source. It will only take us so far, however. So in some ways, a technique repeats a result, like a recipe for a soup. And here you have a picture of a very yummy recipe of lentil soup from a cookbook, Oh She Glows, that I I made actually a few nights ago. That's not my picture, but I wish it were. It looks very yummy around lunchtime. But if what you want to do is make a genuine discovery of something that you haven't discovered before, like the scientific method, and here on our right is a picture of Alice Ball. And I'm just starting to learn a little bit about Alice Ball's history. She was an African-American woman who discovered part of the cure for leprosy, which was an impossible to cure disease in the early 1900s. And so she's instrumental, well, and before, like down to biblical times. So she was a forgotten African-American brilliant researcher who is just sort of coming back into the historical record. So when we have a technique, we can repeat something easily and we hope we'll get the same result. When we have a method, we are actually searching for something that we don't know before. And so it's the difference between going to a weekend course for a conflict where you do learn some very useful techniques about being at least able to ask some questions, to when you can develop more of a method from understanding more of the theory and the concepts behind where the techniques come from. And the reason that we ask questions is that people will only change their minds when they're given the opportunity to get new information or be prompted to discern fresh significance or discern new options. And it's through curiosity that we're thrown back into our own thinking and that we have the opportunity to generate these new possibilities. So that's why questions work, is that it affords us the opportunity to become curious about what it is that we know or value or understand. So it's not just the asking of a question, it's the genuine curiosity behind the question that will really lead to change in what we know and value and decide. So one of the methods for doing this in a shorter way, because the other point that I want to make to go back to active listening is that it also leaves ourselves out of the equation. So that's back to if someone is saying you're a liar, or if the emotion is escalating, we can sort of lose our way if what we're trying to do is paraphrase or we're trying to request clarification. And so one of the techniques, or I should say it's really one of the methods that we use in the conflict analysis and management program is go in, go up, and go out. And it was developed from my dear colleague, John Radford, who's also a colleague of Ron Fisher's in the conflict analysis and management program. And John has extensive experience in working in South Africa as a white mediator in the time of the transition from the apartheid regime to the presidency of Nelson Mandela. And in his work as a mediator, he recognized it's extremely important to be able to recognize ourselves in the system, to be able to notice what it is that's been triggered within us, and to be able to engage with the system and each other from that authentic place of whether we're incurious and certain and closed, or whether we're more engaged, expansive, and curious about others. So go in is look inside, go up, look at the system and ourselves in that system, and then engage by going out. So John often talks about using goggles to go in, and it really is amazing when we are able to go in to ourselves or to reflect on others, that what you have in this picture is the top of the serene landscape in a green plush forest and the sky above, completely different to the life that's working below the surface, the life that's moving, the life that's interacting below the surface. And that's often very true of our interior lives and the lives that we engage with others. So remember back at the beginning, what we do depends on what we know to be true and discern to be significant. And that often rests within us, within our knowing and our valuing and deciding within our consciousness. So to go a little more deeply into this go in, we ask ourselves, what is being triggered in me? How am I being impacted? And how can I ground and connect? Because I often laugh about this with my partner, is that when I am upset or triggered, when I'm self-righteous and angry, I'm terrible at conflict. And it's very difficult sometimes for me to be able to become curious about myself or about others. So one of the things that's really helped me, and we work on in the conflict analysis and management program as well, is how can I ground and connect? How can I become more centered so that I can listen more effectively, or I can become more authentically curious? And then when we go into the going up and going out, we're able to see the system and ourselves within the system. And I use this picture of, which is taken from National Geographic, of a log roller and part of the members of the forestry industry. When there's a log jam, they need to be able to see themselves in the system and the relationship of their log to the other logs. They then need to be able to find the points of leverage where they can move certain logs, and which will cause the whole log jam to start flowing more downstream. So when you have police officers like Paul Pazin, who's the chief of the Denver Police, who's on the Denver television program on the morning news, saying how heartbroken he was by the violence that took place with the rioting and the police, between the rioters and the police, to be able to say how he wants things to change, to do things differently. He sees himself within the system. He links arms with the protesters. There are other people under him who are making change. And I'm not at all an expert within the Denver police force, but I do know that he's using his role in order to try and shift that logjam in ways that are unpredictable. And we certainly, if we know anything about complex conflicts, is that they're not resolvable through our linear problem-solving traditional models. We have to find small points of leverage through which the system can incrementally and then much more substantially change. And that's what John talks about with the idea of going in, going up, and going out, noticing what it is that triggers us, and then becoming more curious and recognizing ourselves within the system. So that from my previous webinar that some of you were at on September 15th, just a week ago, and some of you may have been at the webinar on Monday, where it was the International Day of Peace, where some of my colleagues were talking about the international, some of the issues around international human rights and conflict, as well as domestically about racism, systemic racism, and inequalities related to the COVID pandemic. So sometimes it may feel that we're called to be like a Wonder Woman or a Wonder Person in order to make these kinds of changes. But sometimes it may be enough that we can just be a person wondering about what is impacting me, and who am I in relation to others and in relation to the system. And then it becomes possible to address conflict behavior with authentic curiosity as well as with humility. So when we go back to noticing some of those conflict behaviors in ourselves or in others, I notice that I'm freezing, or I tend to be a little bit more fighty in this moment. I can start checking myself or reflecting others. And that's back to where the techniques are useful in terms of using those words like reflect, but we can talk about, you seem frustrated right now, you seem to be getting angrier. I wonder what might make a difference in the way that I'm speaking with you. You're able to check out what you see and observe within yourself and others. The power tool questions in any kind of conflict is to start wondering, what is the threat and why that decision to defend? Because if what people do is based on what they discern to be significant, what is the threat is a very useful question, not to ask directly, but to start wondering, what is it that's really upsetting you? What's at stake? What are you worried might happen? And what makes that decision the best one to engage in? Why is protesting the decision that you've decided to make, rather than standing and working in this particular way? There's all kinds of questions that we can ask when we're looking for the threat or looking for other options than defend, to be able to engage in more creative problem solving or more collaborative opportunities. So those are the kinds of questions we can ask in order to start generating creativity and collaborative opportunities. I'm going to take just a second to see if there's anyone who wants to say something or ask in the chat. And I'm going to see if I can actually look within the chat in this moment to see if there's something that can come up, because I've got about 5 or 6 more minutes to talk, and then we can have more of a discussion. So someone's asking about a psychologically safe environment. Fantastic. We've got some questions about making better decisions in conflict when they have mental and physical illness. Great. The cultural context, and we're using our culture to fantastic point. So I'll come back to that as well. And we've got, okay, so thank you for Abraham talking about Colin Kaepernick. It's wonderful to see the conversations going on, and I'm super happy to see people speaking with each other in the chat box. So it's good that we're at about 12:38, so we'll be able to have some more of a discussion, and I'll invite you to turn on your mics if you'd like to, or to continue to talk in the chat. So where we've come from so far is we've talked about conflict behavior as a decision to defend in response to a perception of threat. We've talked about roles and absolutely culture as a way that shapes what we know and value and decide. So within culture can be both our heritage as well as various cultures around how we do things around here. So the culture of a police force is a particular way, the culture of activists are particular ways, and there's intersections of a Black police officer has various intersectional identities that lead him or her to position themselves in relation to other communities in specific ways. So culture carries our knowing and our valuing and deciding. Culture is deeply part of our identities, which shapes what it is that's possible for us to know and value and decide within the horizons of what we discern to be significant or what we know to be true. So culture is integral to how we move through the world and how we respond to others. So we've talked about conflict behavior. We've talked about that discerning of threat and the decision to defend. We've also then talked about how it is that people make different decisions is when they understand differently or they discern different significance. And when we're trying to create psychologically safe environments, I'd like to sort of start by saying we can't actually create an environment that's safe for someone else. We can do our best to keep ourselves safe, but back to the notion of others might discern threat in what we may seem to be a relatively benign behavior. So for example, even a decision to look at someone directly in the eye may be taken by some to be more confrontational and others to receive it as more sort of forthright and direct. So the extent to which we can recognize when others are responding defensively, we can start wondering what the threat might be. And so we're not actually able to create safety for others, but we can certainly recognize when they may be experiencing threat and be able to wonder and create conditions for them to be able to talk about what the threat is and to be able to discuss it, or for them to be able to, for you together to be able to work towards mutual safety. Again, it's unfortunate I can't create I can't answer that as in as much depth as I'd like, and I certainly welcome anyone else who has experience with working in spaces which may be less safe for all to jump in and provide additional context. It's one of the wonderful things about having groups of experienced people meeting in a forum like this is that we can share our collective wisdom. So we've talked about then how people make different decisions, and certainly we make better decisions when we're not contracted by threat, when we have more sense of security, safety, or a sense of being understood. We're more likely to be curious about self and other. We've talked about some of the limits of technique, although it can be useful in certain contexts. And we've also talked about the principles of go in, go up, and go out, where we can notice what's at stake for us. We can wonder about that, and we can wonder about that for others, looking at ourselves within a system and making those small incremental changes that can sometimes lead to big results. So I'm wanting you to take just a second now for yourselves as well to think about when we ourselves are righteous or certain, when our curiosity may be blocked, we might be more trying to fix others. We might give advice. We might try to persuade them, or we might ourselves shut down. So there are habits that I can do when I'm locked into my own certainty. And I often then have a practice of trying to find ways of grounding, of connecting more spaciously to my own knowing, valuing, and deciding. So here are 3 things that I do to become more spacious. And I'm going to invite you in a few minutes or like few seconds to put in the chat box as well how you ground or connect. So you can start doing that as well. So some people may have ways in the moment of finding their way back to their center, or finding a way of a phrase that you might use, an image that you may call to mind, a practice that you do, or a way of being present in a way that can help you be in the moment and not carried away by your sense of threat or certainty, or your own, or sometimes even a disorienting confusion. So we've got some breathing, there's a way of being in nature, there's a mindfulness break. So keep putting those in, and we can then have that same, because they're so complex, we can't put them into a Menti of just one word. But I'm also inviting you to do that, so that my hope is that in connecting to that sense of self more deeply, that when you leave this webinar in 15 minutes, you'll also be able to carry that with you as you go out to the various roles that you are in your multiple lives. And that you'll be able to take something of somebody else as well, so that we're not in this alone, that we do have a way of connecting to self and others, which is really, in a way, transcendent. And that's a way of that we are within a system that is much, much larger than any one of us, whether it's the ecosystem or this kind of learning system, that we are both deeply, we're cognitive beings, and we're cognitive beings in relation to others, connected through our cultures, connected to our past, and connected to our future. And we start thinking of systems in that very dynamic way, and that each of us within our roles, so in your role as participant now, and my role as webinar giver, we are mutually impacting each other and creating the system. We're co-creating the system in which we are spending this hour together. So Linda's talking about what's happening in her body and try to look at the big picture. Adams talks about being alone in the woods, which is that way of that sort of recalling that sense of connection and peace. This is a lake that I often go to, which for me is a very grounding, and there's something about water which will connect me to myself and nature much more clearly. In my role as mother, there's my 2 kids and their half faces, so that's an important sense for me of being connected to future generations, as well as a playful spirit. And I was actually looking for images of rest, because I often find just taking a moment or 2 of just rest can sometimes be really helpful before going back into an engagement with others. And I saw this picture of an otter, which I found absolutely hilarious, because it looks like just the comfiest otter possible. So, and that comes from the website is Expedition Wildlife. I want to leave you as well, before we get into another wider conversation, is these 2 individuals who I find inspiring. And I mentioned it at the last webinar, which I did with my colleague Jennifer Willinga from the School of Communication and Culture here at Royal Roads, and the recording is available for those of you who are interested in going back to it. But on the left is Rebecca Brucehoff, who's a New Jersey transgender student who created a great deal of space for transgender students in the New Jersey school system by talking about her experience. And once again, she's not alone in her ability to speak in front of the New Jersey school board. She's surrounded by a community of parents and friends and neighbors who have helped her become who she is. And as a result, Marvel Comics has started a project of creating comic books from real life heroes. And so Rebecca is the first to be featured in the Marvel Comics. So there she is holding her her comic book. And on the right, many of you would recognize Murray Sinclair, who was the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who spent years listening with significant humility to the countless stories of injustice and violence and spiritual injury that was inflicted on Indigenous people, and maintains this presence of wisdom and compassion that I find really compelling, as he's very steadfast in his ability to instigate conflict, to and I'm saying that very carefully, but to advance social change, and in creative and collaborative ways as well. I come back to that because sometimes it is necessary to advance conflict in order to highlight injustice or to bring about change. And so that in the conflict program that I'm in, that Ron and John and others have been involved with, we don't talk so much now about conflict resolution as building conflict capacities. How do we tolerate the discomfort of our threatened feelings to be able to engage more meaningfully in changing patterns of interaction that have oppressed others and ourselves for a long time? And I'm not claiming as a person, as a white person, that I share the same oppressions as others, but there's a way in which the systems that we're in can oppress us differently, and the way our privileges are afforded to us also gives us the responsibilities to engage in system changing in different ways. So back to how we are as individuals affects our knowing and valuing and deciding, and the changes that we're able to make systemically, sometimes through conflict and sometimes through creative or collaborative means. So with that, I'm going to go back to the question of how you ground or connect yourselves. We've had lots of comments in the chat, which has been great. And so there's been a lot of conversation going on about books that could be resources, or what people are finding to be very helpful. So we have the idea of forest bathing and other kinds of helpful ways of connecting to self and other, and that wider system of which we are a part. So we have 10 more minutes. And so I'll go back to this image that I find inspiring of these two very different individuals who are system changing in their own ways. Go back to a review of what we were, some of the things I promised that we'd talk about. We explored the before and after with our word, with the word cloud that we made. We understood some of the ways that conflict can emerge and change. We learned the difference between a technique and a method. I talked about how we can involve ourselves as part of a conflict system and consider the possibilities of supporting authentic curiosity to ourselves and others. All that in like 50 minutes or less. I'll leave you with this thought. And I'm just going to have to cut out my chat so that I can see it better, because the slide is just cut off to one side for me. So when we walk to the, okay, I'll just go back. Sorry for this little, there we go. Because you've already read it now. Because you guys are way faster readers than I am speakers. But I love it when you walk to the edge of all the light you have and take that first step into the darkness of the unknown. You must believe that one of two things will happen. There will be something solid for you to stand upon, or you will be taught how to fly. That's a poem from Patrick Overton, which Cindy Blackstock, who is another remarkable woman who's been an advocate for Indigenous children for a great number of years. This was the poem that inspired her to step forward, to take action, to address the systemic injustice towards Indigenous children, and she's been a steadfast advocate since then. So please now feel free to unmute or to raise your hand, and I'm going to ask either Selena or Alana or Karen, who have been supporting us and the team, to if there's anything that you'd like to summarize or highlight in terms of where the conversation has gone or the questions that have emerged. I really welcome that. I also want to invite you, if you'd like to follow up with Selena or Alana or Karen, to feel free to reach out to them. They're going to send out a link to the recording for anyone who wasn't able to make it. but they're also the people who can answer any questions that you might have about Royal Roads or about other topics that are coming up in our webinar series. For those of you who are interested of where I'm situated, I'm in the Masters of Arts and the Graduate Diploma in Conflict Analysis and Management, and we're within a School of Humanitarian Studies, which also includes programs in disaster and emergency management and human security and peace building. But there's some of my colleagues here from the Faculty of Management and from the School of Leadership Studies, and I can honestly say that at Royal Roads, I would love to be able to take any of these programs because the quality of scholars and administrative staff in Royal Roads is something that I'm really proud to be a part of. The programs here genuinely have students at the center, and the diversity of students and the quality of engagement is really remarkable, as we've seen even with this group of participants here. And then just because I'm a scholar and I need to attribute things, here are some of the references that you're welcome to follow up on. They happen to be my some of my articles about the insight approach. But it's also really important, as I've tried to do throughout, people sometimes get intimidated by academic writing or by academic conversations. And when we think about references or anything, how we cite people, it's because we want to respect the teachings that have come before us. And at Royal Roads as well, we have worked to integrate that level of respect with both the written text as well as with some of the oral teachings from Indigenous elders. And we're learning more as we go. And certainly Teresa Bell in the Writing Center has been fantastic in about pulling together the Four Feathers Writing Guide, which is available on our website in ways in which has helped me as a writer to develop my voice, as well as my recognition of the importance of bringing good heart and good mind to all of the work that we do. So I'm going to go back to the beginning as we talk about the bridge and invite any other comments or questions that may come up if someone has raised their hand or if someone would like to share.
Hi, Marnie. So we've had a few questions in our chat box regarding cultural context. So one question in particular, one of our participants was curious to learn more about culturally informed conflict styles and conflict resolution, and was asking if anyone has any resources to share around that perspective.
Wonderful question. So somebody who I deeply admire is Michelle LeBaron. And so culturally informed practices is much, much more than cultural sensitivity training, which through research has shown that can actually like reinforce stereotypes. So cultural humility is really one of the keystones to culturally informed conflict resolution practices, about knowing where my biases may be as in the particular identity and background that I come from, being able to ask again with humility and curiosity to be able to recognize that other cultures have different and authentic forms of conflict resolution or even engagement, or as we talk about conflict capacity, and to be able to wonder, ask, and engage in respectful and appropriate ways. So that's a short answer, but Michelle LeBaron is a wonderful author in that regard, and many of the anti-racism writers as well, like Robin DiAngelo and others who are shaping the way for being able to have difficult conversations with different ways of engaging with conflict have been really helpful.
Thank you so much, Marnie.
And so her last name is LeBaron. I have somebody asking that, so I'm going to just put that into the chat box. Although if there's other people who know her, please feel free to jump in. But here she's coming, Michelle LeBaron. Here you go.
Oh, wonderful. We had another set of questions come up around techniques for dealing with conflict when there's a clear power imbalance between different parties.
So that's one that you could write a long paper about. And so one of the things that we talk about in an early course in our conflict program is about different kinds of power. And so one of the ways that I find very helpful to think about power is it's the ability to influence others, knowing, valuing, and deciding. And there's different kinds of power. So there's the coercive power where if I'm in a position where I can absolutely dictate to you, Selena, about what you're going to do, I have the ability to impose my decision on yours. On the other hand, if I have a more positional power as your manager, I have an ability to make some kind of influence on your knowing and your valuing and deciding by virtue of my actions and what I'm able to request, as well as what the limits to those might be. Then there's other kinds of power where if Selena and I are involved in a conflict and I am her manager and she's a unionized staff person, there's different kinds, although I have some kind of formal power, she's got a kind of relational power that may make me as her manager much more vulnerable to, I don't want to have a harassment complaint against me, for example. There's obviously gender power, there's economic power, there's the ability or privilege of myself being an able-bodied person or an English-speaking person. So there's all kinds of power that can be exercised and resisted. So it's a very kind of complex question about how to address conflict depending on the role that we're in, on our identities, on how we're positioned, and where we are in the system about how to address conflict, and to be able to engage in building our conflict capacity to wonder about others and ourselves to make changes through points of leverage. So that's my complex answer to a very excellent question around power, but it is truly one of those fascinating questions that have engaged conflict scholars for a long time. So Laurie was asking about the second power. Well, Laurie, I wish I could sort of, again, it's not very schematic, but I've talked about different kinds of power. If we look at it as knowing, valuing, and deciding. So there's the coercive power, say, of a police officer, and then there's more of a relational power, let's say, or a role-related power. And I could refer you to a Bernard Mayer in, let's check out Bernard Mayer. I'll put his, so he talks about different kinds of power, and he's got his, and I wish I could remember the book. So if any other of my colleagues or scholars can remember the book, please shoot it into the chat box so we can all be smart together. I'm not really the answer lady up here, and that we all have little pieces of the answer puzzle. We've just we're coming near the end of the 1 o'clock's time. So I also want to respect that. If you'd like to stick around, please feel free. I'll be here for as long as people want to talk to me. And well, given, at the outside level of, 10 or 15 extra minutes, but please do stay, and then you can feel free to turn on your mic and we can have more of a conversation. There, Renata, thank you. The dynamics of conflict. Renata's the star. And there's Robin, way to go. These are people who were students of mine, and that feels like my life has become worthwhile that they can zoom on back. Robin and Renata, you two should meet each other. You're from different cohorts. It's awesome. Way to go.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sticking around, Marnie. We have perhaps one more question that encapsulates some of the other dialogue that was happening in the chat box that can send us all on our way. So this was posed by one of our participants, and they had noted that another source/cause of conflict seems to be people operating with the same goals, but on different timelines or with different senses of urgency. Would this fall under a disconcerned threat, as in a solution is needed now, otherwise there may be a negative consequence?
So it's a great question. And one of the things that I think is so important about this model of, from the insight approach, is that we actually don't know what other people are thinking and what kind of threats that they're discerning. If we have, we talk about different levels of threat. So there can be kind of a personal identity threat. So if, for example, again, Selena and I are fighting, and she's not actually my employee, we're colleagues in the university, just so you know. If we're fighting, and so she has a very high timeline, like we've got to get this assignment in by Friday, this report in by Friday, and I am wanting, we have the same goal, that report in by Friday, but I want to do an art project, and she'd like to do statistical data. So where we have this difference is I could be, as I as I ask her this, she could be offended that that I'm minimizing her ability to make charts. So she has some kind of personal threat. There may be some kind of practical threat that we have differently. For Selena, this report may be really crucial for her job review. And so she's got her sense of her job being on the line in the way that I don't. There may be some kind of relational threat in that I think we both know how a team member should act. And if Selena's not acting right because she is dismissing my suggestion, whereas she has a sense of this is how we speak to each other. We shoot each other's arguments down, and that's how we're going to kind of come up with the best one. So we may have there may be a gap in how we're relating as team members, or there may be another kind of systemic threat in that Selena happens to be best friends with our boss. And so I'm feeling that there's some kind of threat that if I don't agree with her, then I'm going to get in trouble with the boss. So all that to say is there's hundreds of times, there's so many different ways that people can respond to threat that we can't know unless we ask. And sometimes we have to guess and then check it out. But that's why it's incredibly important to keep our curiosity so that we don't assume. And even in the act of engaging with Selena about what might be concerning to her, our system changes. So we are able to have different kind of conversations that can generate more creativity and lead to more collaboration.
That was beautiful, Marnie. Thank you. For the folks who are continuing to pop questions in the chat box, thank you so much. These questions are wonderful and helping inform the types of webinars we can continue hosting as well, knowing there's curiosity in the realm of conflict and gender, context and conflict. So please feel free to continue popping in your questions or asking any questions in response to our follow-up email as well. That's all very helpful information to us.
Yeah, so Nancy, I want to follow up because you're also sort of near the end around the thoughts on the TKI conflict instrument as a conceptual tool for understanding conflict. So my general sense of conflict instruments, and I'm not familiar with the TKI, I don't think, and you're welcome to come into the chat, because conflict instruments tend to be useful to be able to start having conversations where there's a sense of being able to do some kind of self-reflection on a particular context or a particular role, and then being able to have the conversation. I find them can be somewhat limiting in that the typical model that we use is compete, collaborate, compromise, and what's the other one? I think these tend to be, there's the 4 quadrants. I can be competitive in certain circumstances and collaborative in others, or I can be accommodating in others, or uncompromising. So it really depends on the context and the situation and on what's at stake for me. So having said that, there can be styles that I tend to go for or habits of mind, but I think an instrument is only useful for the dialogue that it can foster, so that I have some recognition and some curiosity then towards Selena and myself. Oh, I'm a blue and you're a mauve, Selena. What does that mean for you? And how can our blueness and mauveness interact? But if I just happen to know she's a mauve, I'm more likely to again make the same errors of assumptions unless I'm actually able to have a conversation with her about what does it mean for her to be mauve and how does she behave in her mauvishness if we're assigning colors to particular conflict styles. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, there's Eleanor. There's compete, collaborate, accommodate, and compromise. So I think those are the 4. If there's somebody else in there. Avoidance, thank you. There we go. Yep, that would be it. See, really, a group is way smarter than one person. If I was giving a lecture, I would probably have those in my notes and be able to present them. But thankfully, this is just a webinar and a conversation. So I don't have to be totally, as I said, the answer lady. Yeah, there we go, hive mind. Anyone else left, or are we pretty well done? Thank you, Andrew. Thanks, Eleanor.
I think we are pretty well done for today. We have many folks sharing their thank yous and their need to pop off for meetings. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. Marnie, I'll pass it back to you to send us on our way.
Great. Well, that was lovely to see everybody. And I'm going to go back and have a look at that tree, which grounded me at the very beginning. And so just to sort of encourage you to take away whatever it is that you got from this and from each other. So thank you for showing up, and I hope to see you at another webinar in the future.